Literacy is dead. At least that's what a lot of people are saying. We don't think it's true. We do, however, think literacy is about to look different, a lot different. For many people, the words "the end" signify either satisfaction or sorrow. What happens after the end? How do words become catalysts for progress and advancement?
Join us today for the Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. Hi, I'm Amy Boland, literacy specialist, writer, and college instructor.
And I'm Holland Webb, a full-time writer and editor. And this is the Afterword. Last week, we began our conversation with Tim Davis, an award-winning author and illustrator, and Cynthia Faber Smith, the former art director at Highlights for Children and Science magazines. We learned about how illustrations help support text, and text supports illustrations. Join us for the conclusion of that conversation. What's a metaphor we can use to understand how illustration supports literacy and storytelling? Tim?
I was thinking about that question a little bit, and you know, when you grow a garden, sometimes you have seed packages at the beginning of each row, because this is what you anticipate is going to grow there if you planted your seeds correctly. So I look at illustrations like that, is that you have that seed package there and say, as you watch, as you work your way through the story, this is what you're going to see. These are the kind of things that are going to grow into your mind, if you want to put it that way.
So it grows, the illustrations grow the story as you continue to read through it.
And they tell you what to expect to see in your head.
That's awesome. I love that. Well, and I also love, that little adage, pictures tell 1,000 words. So we know that, and Cindy, you mentioned it also about, when you're trying to persuade and you've got a picture that is supporting that story. I'd like us to talk a little bit about how book illustrations support older students, not necessarily even older elementary, but even past middle school, high school, who are reading, and they might be past that little picture book stage, but they would benefit from seeing or creating illustrations. So, Tim, why don't you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, to go back to what we were talking about, that as they get older, their verbalization skills are improving, so they're able to picture things in words. So I guess I want to take them to a little different level. For instance, I'm working on a story now, which has an island theme, and I want to do it in a style that would hearken to the way island art tends to be, use that kind of color scheme, so that they can understand not just what it is, but maybe a little bit of the culture that I'm trying to project into the story as well.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, even as an older student, young adult, sometimes these illustrations help build on the story and give maybe some of that prior knowledge. Maybe they haven't been to these locations before. So that illustration is supporting the comprehension.
Yes, that's the idea, is to push their understanding to a little bit higher level.
Awesome. What about you, Cindy?
I think that no matter what age we are, but especially when we are kind of trying to figure out what's next in our lives, right? And we recognize that there's so much going on around us, that the stories can lead us down paths of interest and help us understand what we can be. And I think that whether that's a story that's fiction or nonfiction, there's so much that we learn from reading about other people. And I know Tim has a lot of experience working with stories that cover a huge spans of topic, and all those topics that we can learn about, all the cultures that we can learn about, help us ultimately, as we figure out where we are in this world, they help us understand other people, deal with other people, find our place with other people.
So we're sort of taking it past a literal understanding of the text to something a little beyond that. Might have a more thematic elements to it, or like Cindy's saying, a little bit more that will challenge them personally.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that. That's good.
Graphic novels are becoming a popular way to introduce older kids and teens to literature. I know there's some controversy around that. Could one of you share a little bit about what is a graphic novel and how graphic novels may help promote literacy or how they may help hinder it?
I think that graphic novels are sort of a reflection of just the world becoming more visual. That's part of it. Pictures are becoming much more important to people than words in the general culture. So it seems like just a natural development that graphic novels would become more popular. That doesn't mean that the story isn't just as significant, because as we've talked about, the pictures, especially when you're doing a sequential book with that many pictures in it, and believe me, that is a lot of artwork. And when illustrators do that kind of work, they usually need to take a long vacation when they're done, because it wears them down. It's so much material that they have to produce. So it's constantly telling the story, pushing it forward in visual means, that I think it just sort of makes it difficult for somebody to not get it. I mean, it's right out there. It's keeping on stimulating your vision about what the story is. When I read books at night, I don't read picture books. I'm going to read books with just words. And sometimes I use them to help me go to sleep, because it is a little easier to go to sleep and to allow your mind to relax when you're just concentrating on text, because of the processing that you have to go through. Visually, it's very unlikely that you're going to go to sleep if you're looking at a graphic novel. So I do think it does engage your mind a little more consistently than text would alone. Keeps you awake, if you will.
Yeah. Wonderful.
I had never thought of that.
Yeah.
Cindy, did you have something you wanted to add about graphic novels?
Well, as Tim was talking about, it's sequential visuals, right? And I feel like that is so much a product of how our way of communicating is more and more visual, especially with social media. So if you think about a graphic novel being a sequential illustration, it's very much like an Instagram story or a Snapchat kind of thing. And I think that's a great attraction for the younger generation to that kind of storytelling, because they are actually telling those stories. And that's the thing about social media. Everybody's telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So the graphic novel, to me, you can look at it as almost the ultimate social media, that it is a way, if a young person becomes interested in a graphic novel, it is a way for them to see how their thoughts can be complete in a story, and a longer story, a story that has plot and multiple characters. And they can understand that structure of storytelling that might interest them in other forms. It's also a great adult literacy pathway to adult literacy, because the pictures help the adult understand the story without making them feel as though they're reading a Dick and Jane book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I see that with my students, because many of my students are struggling learners. And so giving them that entry point, I think this is a great entry point for students and for adults to engage. I've heard that word several times, engage the mind, and support this idea of increasing that literacy process. That's a wonderful point that you brought up.
And I think mentioning adults too, graphic biographies and autobiographies are growing in popularity. And so are journalistic comics and graphic medicine. Kind of interesting to me.
I mentioned that I had just gone to Comic-Con here in Greenville.
Uh-huh.
It's interesting to me that there are many, many adults who are reading, collecting, celebrating the characters in graphic novels and comics. And you also noted that the majority are male. One of the things that I think any literacy person probably will say is that boys have a harder time learning to read in general than girls do. But I think that that seems to flip when you get into the graphic novels. They seem to feed on that more. And maybe it's because of the visual nature of it, but it also might be the action. One of the things that I think maybe a lot of books that are written with school-age kids in mind may not have as much action in them as a typical comic or graphic novel would.
Mm-hmm.
And so that appeals more to young boys.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a trend that women are purchasing more than 1 out of 3 comics and graphic novels that are being sold. So that's an interesting trend. But I think the point of the action in a story and using the illustration to help tell that story is very, very powerful. One of the things that Holland and I came to this connection with, even talking about the podcast, is this idea of how sometimes illustrators and stories have such power. And we found this little bit of trivia. The illustrations for a very special book were carried out of Paris on bicycles by artists just days before Hitler invaded. And that was...
Curious George.
Yes.
I think he's not only my favorite animated character, he may be my favorite character of all time.
Yes.
Curious George Goes to the Hospital has got to be the best book ever written.
And the washing machine and the kite. But think about it, and I'm going to tie that right back into what you were saying, Tim. They all involve what? Action.
A lot of action.
Action.
And the story is there. And Cindy, something that you brought up, these are stories that are true. These are stories that children can trust, and they match. And I really appreciate what you all have brought to the table tonight.
So who is your favorite illustrator? Tim?
I was thinking about various different illustrators I like in different styles. So I don't know if I can give you one, but let's say realistic. I love Norman Rockwell. I think his stuff is classic. But if you look at a more modern realistic person, like if you're familiar with James Gurney, who did a lot of stuff in Dinotopia, he also did a lot of stuff in National Geographic before that. His stuff is beautiful. But, if you look at a totally opposite end of the spectrum with the more iconic illustrations, somebody like Bob Stack, who does New Yorker covers, is really excellent at what he does. So to say I like one better than the other, the styles are so different that I admire them both for what they're strong at.
Cindy, what about you? Who's your favorite illustrator?
Tim David.
There you
Well
go. Well
said.
said.
That's so nice of you, Cindy. Thank you.
Well, I love you. But
Love you too, Cindy. You're my favorite art director too.
that was the correct answer. Of all time, it would have to be N.C. Wyeth. And if you're familiar with his illustrations, they are so powerful. And the details in the illustrations are just the kind of art you can get lost in. And while I don't consider illustrations fine art, you cannot deny that when you look at N.C. Wyeth. He is one of the few illustrators that I know of that really take it to that point. And it's not always necessary or needed or even desirable for an illustration to go to this point. But in the types of classics that he illustrated, these illustrations of N.C. Wyeth were just incredible. And we are very lucky to be in this area where we have some N.C. Wyeth. If you can get to, I think it's the Brandywine Museum in Pennsylvania has another beautiful collection.
Actually, that is my favorite museum. Some of the best illustrators that have ever lived have worked there.
That's a good plug.
There's a museum in Ohio, too, and I believe it's Ohio, at a private college, and it's the largest museum of children's book covers in the world, I think.
I don't know that one.
Is there a Fairfield College? Fairfield University? Something like that. Somebody Google it.
Well, I think our takeaway from our conversation is that used correctly, illustrations can tell powerful story. They are important tools in literacy development across a diverse readership.
Thank you, Cindy and Tim, for a valuable and interesting conversation on how illustrations and stories support each other and support literacy. Next week, we'll be talking with Ann Norton, a research librarian and educator who specializes in investigating the stories of the families of people routinely absent from official records, such as textile workers, African Americans, women, children, and the poor. She'll be joining best-selling romantic suspense novelist Elizabeth Goddard, whose most recent work, Never Let Go, features a forensic genealogist, and we're going to learn what that is, even. Anne and Elizabeth will be talking about how and why you can learn and tell your family's story. Don't forget to subscribe to the AfterwordPodcast.com, like us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. We will see you next week.